let's start right now. And today we're very fortunate to have Professor Michael Yahuda here to share his view about a very important relationship in Asia, that is China and Japan. We know that China's been rising very fast, and Japan has to be #1 for a while, but now it seems that this position will be overtaken by China. And Professor Yahuda is a very well-established professor and wrote about 6 or 7 books in this area about Japan and China, and over several hundreds of articles and book chapters. And he used to be a professor at London School of Economics and Political Science, and till 2003, right? And after that, he has been a visiting professor at the George Washington University, and he knows Singapore very well because he used to be a senior visiting research fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. And let's welcome back to Singapore again. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I've been sort of working on China and Japan relations for a few years, and I started off thinking that they were sort of condemned to be rivals. I started just before there was the huge riots in China against the Japanese in April 2005, which led to destruction of Japanese property in many Chinese cities, and it seemed then as if the relationship could only go from bad to worse. And then, almost as suddenly, the following year, when Prime Minister Abe visited Beijing, relations seemed to improve, and they've been really improving, in a sense, ever since. And at the same time, I think many scholars in China, and I think attitudes in Japan, suggest that although the relationship has moved to a better stage, it's the improvement is still fairly shallow. Now, there is a kind of a contradiction here, because the economic relations between China and Japan have been deep and have been deepening. In fact, since about 2004, China's trade with Japan has exceeded in value Japan's trade with the United States. And yet there are some deep problems between them, and I think part of the problem is that not all of these problems that they have are really appreciated by each other, let alone by the other side. Let me explain. First of all, these two powers have been interacting in one form or another for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. And for most of that time, China saw itself as superior to Japan, and the Japanese too acknowledged China as the major center of culture and civilization. There wasn't really all that much contact between them during this period. And the situation changed as Japan began to modernize with the Meiji period from 1868 onwards. And although China tried to modernize at that time, roughly at that time, their early attempts at modernization failed, and Japan, by the turn of the century, had become a modern state, and in fact it had defeated China in the War of 1895 over Korea, and 10 years later it defeated Russia, the first Asian country to defeat a European or Western nation. And the Japanese certainly felt themselves superior to the Chinese at that time. Well, but now we've reached a point since the end of the Cold War where both powers can be seen as great powers at the same time. And never in history have they had that kind of relationship. They have no historical experience to fall back on. There are no institutional ways of expressing this. And as a result, they feel that they are been having a very uneasy relationship. It's often described as one involving security dilemmas, whereby if each one sees itself as defensive, and yet whenever either side is seen to improve its military hardware, it immediately raises objections on the other side, and quite often it leads to certain kinds of countermeasures. And so, in that sense, we have here what some regard as a kind of a classic security dilemma, in which the best form of security would be to find ways of engaging some forms of armed control, or in recognizing the security interests of the other and making accommodations or management in some way or other. But that doesn't seem to be happening. In fact, you could argue that they have competing national security interests, not only because they have different views as to where to draw the line in the sea between them in terms of the rights to use of the resources, both of the sea itself and more importantly perhaps of the resources beneath the seabed, especially energy and so on. They have disputes over islands, and there is a sort of enormous distrust between them. The Chinese argue that Japan still has what they would regard as unwelcome relations with Taiwan, because Taiwan was a colony of Japan for 50 years, following the first defeat of China by Japan in 1895, and contrary to the experience that the Chinese had from being occupied by the Japanese, the Taiwanese experience on the whole was positive. The Japanese regarded Taiwan as a resource to be cultivated, and they helped to build a degree of modernity in Taiwan. And many of the elite of the older generation in Taiwan speak Japanese, and there's still a reservoir of good feeling towards each other by the peoples on both sides. And the Chinese therefore feel that that Japan still has undue influence in Taiwan, and especially towards, if you like, democratic Taiwan. These problems really began to appear from the end of the Cold War. Up till that time, the differences between them were in some senses subdued or suppressed. Why did it come out really at the end of the Cold War? Well, this has something to do with the development of the identities and debates about identities in each country. So with at the end of the Cold War for China, from the period of Tiananmen of June the 4th, 1989, till the collapse of the Soviet Union in July 1991, was in many respects a terrible period. And the big issue, in a way, for the Chinese since then has been how to avoid the Chinese Communist Party going the way of the Soviet Communist Party. And to this end, really, there were debates within China as to how best this could be done. For many, the best way would have been to, if you like, build up the barriers and revert back to some form of socialist command economy, and in other words, to emphasize much more the socialist or communist heritage or dimension of China. And it was left really to Deng Xiaoping to break away from the majority view and say, no, the way to ensure that China would not go the way of the Soviet Union was to ensure that the people of China would have a better economic future, and that attention should be paid to developing the economy. And the argument was that one of the reasons for the fall of the Soviet Union was that the economic system deprived their people of a reasonable economic livelihood. And so Deng Xiaoping, in a way, broke from the majority view. He had what was called then the Southern Tour, when he went near Hong Kong, and was instrumental in changing the direction of China to putting the emphasis on very rapid economic growth, integration with the international economy, while at the same time maintaining tight Chinese Communist Party rule. And so what happened was that this undermined the position of socialism, or if you like, communism, as the main ideology with which to appeal to the Chinese people. So as a result, there was greater emphasis upon what the Chinese called patriotism. There was a move of making the party not so much the representative of workers and peasants and so on, but as being the embodiment of Chinese history, of Chinese culture, and of Chineseness. So one of the ways in which this was done was to build up the party as the organization that had defeated Japan in the war that finished in 1945, much earlier. Under Mao, the historic basis for the communist rule was defeat of the Kuomintang, defeat of Chiang Kai-shek and his forces. And with Mao, the emphasis was all the time on class struggle. And it meant that Taiwan, where the Kuomintang was still seen as the uncompleted civil war, and as really the class enemy. But with Deng Xiaoping emphasizing much more the issue of national unity, a new approach was taken towards Taiwan. No longer was it talked about as liberation that you do with class enemies, as it were, but of reunification. And therefore, the people of Taiwan were seen as part of China as well. And the result was that it meant that the historic victory or the claimed historic victory of the Chinese communists was no longer from the civil war of defeating the Kuomintang, but rather earlier defeating Japan. And this had a big effect on the nature of education that younger people were given. And also it created a different basis for the relationship with Japan. Although there were, for example, anti-Japanese war films in the Maoist period, usually the key figure used to be a Kuomintang type person who was seen to collaborate with the enemy and would be unmasked at the last moment so that the workers and peasants could win their tactical victory over the battle at hand. Of course, since then, the Kuomintang figure has gone, and so it's just, if you like, the Chinese people versus the Japanese people. And the result has been that, therefore, the notion of the new Chinese identity, political identity at home, embodied a very strong anti-Japanese element, which shaped the nature of the relationship very much in the 1990s and really up till the year 2000. This also broke an attitude that had been in the Chinese Communist Party that had come out paradoxically at the same time that Deng Xiaoping initiated these big changes, that China had to look for models of economic development abroad. And in the 1980s, Japan was one of the places they looked to. And because Japan was one of the places they looked to, it led to a division in the leadership between those who still wanted to hold on to elements of the command economy, of the socialist tradition, and so on. Therefore, seeing Japan as part of the capitalist economy and society with values that were damaging to China. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, that element of disparaging Japan became even stronger. So if that was part of an identity issue in China, in Japan too, at the end of the Cold War also brought about challenges to the existing way in which Japanese had thought about their identity. Because from 1945 through till the end of the Cold War, the Japanese had what was called the San Francisco system, in which, in effect, they passed on to the Americans the job of looking after security and defense of Japan, while they focused more or less entirely on rebuilding the Japanese economy. And it meant that the whole structure of politics in Japan was shaped by that. And Japan's foreign relations were also shaped by that, emphasizing the economy. And indeed, the Japanese were so successful that by the late 80s, they were seen almost as a rival to the United States. And in fact, the talk of Asian century first was based on Japan. And in the United States, Japanese were worried about Japan bashing, just as the Chinese worry about sort of anti-Chinese elements and so on. And just as there's the belief that somehow China is going to be number one, so there was a very famous book written by a Harvard professor, Japan as number one. And the Japanese were at the height of their self-confidence that their way of running the economy, their model and so on, was the model for Asia and for everywhere else for that matter. And then suddenly the bubble burst. And the bursting of the bubble coincided with the end of the Cold War. It wasn't caused by the end of the Cold War, but nevertheless it coincided with that. And the Japanese have been really struggling ever since to work out a new way of organizing themselves at home and portraying themselves abroad. they came under a lot of pressure from the Americans to contribute more to the alliance, because the one glue that had held them together, and that was the opposition to the Soviet Union, that had gone. So the American view was that Japan should do more to share the burden, as it was seen by the United States. But within Japan, there were those who sought to go along with this, and thought that this was the way in which Japan would be able to be strong again and play a big part in international relations. There are some who did it for nationalistic reasons, and who had thought all along that the relationship with the United States was not only an unequal one, but it was demeaning to Japan, and there were both right-wing and left-wing views on this. So the Japanese, in a sense, have been grappling with these sorts of issues for the last 20 years. And now that we've got a new government coming in, it's bringing out afresh, but in a rather different way, these same kinds of issues. What should be Japan's role? How should Japan somehow manage both the United States and relations with Asia? There have been sort of various proposals. I won't go into them. But what has happened has been that these arguments about identity within each country have made it difficult to improve relations between them. And relations, in a way, were able to be improved in 2006 for essentially two reasons. One was the change of generational leaders in China, so that the generation of Jiang Zemin was one that had actually experienced the Japanese occupation as teenagers, or even into the early 20s, whereas Hu Jintao himself was not born till 1942, and therefore he has no real experience of the occupation and the terrors and problems of that, and therefore his generation did not have the same kind of emotional baggage as the previous one. And in addition, the second reason was that really stemmed from China's overall foreign policy, which required good relations with neighbors for economic reasons as much as any other, because these were essential if the economy in China was to continue to grow fast. And the party would know that it would not be able to survive if the economy was not growing at sufficient rate, so as not only to ensure that urban people would have a degree of prosperity and feel that the future for their children was improving, but also that the millions or so who every year who are coming onto the job market would be able to find employment. So the one thing that stood out as a problem was the relationship with Japan, and so the two sides were able to reach an understanding, and this has been strengthened through visits of their top leaders. They have also found a way of putting the history issue aside. As I tried to suggest, although the history issue is not without a basis in fact, it was something that was developed as much for political reasons as anything else. Now, if we then sort of look at how the two are developing their relationship now and how they're dealing with the region around them, clearly central to this is Japan's alliance with the United States. This is seen on the Chinese side. This is now seen on the whole as beneficial. There was a time when Chinese suspected that instead of this being an arrangement which stopped Japan from becoming an independent military power in its own right, and therefore the alliance being a good thing, there was a concern at a certain period that far from this being a good thing, that this might be a dangerous thing for China, because here they would have Japan and the United States in a way ganging up together to limit China's rise and also to prevent China from reunifying with Taiwan. However, with the fact that Japan seems to be in deep domestic trouble, with a sense as well that Japan is declining, with also a sense that because the Americans have deep problems in Afghanistan and Iraq, and also, of course, having very deep financial problems, the Chinese leadership seems to have taken a more benign view of the Japan-American alliance and feel that in many respects they can work with it. And so there is still a degree of uncertainty, and that is, should China seek to think of the new situation as a new kind of triangle, centered on Beijing, Tokyo, Washington, or should China really focus on the so-called partnership with the United States and leave Japan in a somewhat sort of secondary position, with China really dealing directly with the United States on regional issues like Korea and Taiwan, and then more broadly following on from the sort of, if you like, the rhetoric of the Obama administration, which seeks to make China some kind of partner in dealing with the international situation that we have in the world today, emphasizing much more, if you like, the new security issues rather than traditional security. By that I mean dealing with things like climate change, terrorism, health matters, and energy, and a whole range of issues connected with that. And so in China there's still, if you like, a division as to how to deal with Japan in that way. More broadly, although the leadership may claim or may feel that the best way for them is to avoid confrontations with the United States, accept the fact that on the whole they're working with an international system that has been set up by the United States, but it is an international system that has served China well. After all, China's rise and its rapid sort of expansion of its economic interests throughout the world has occurred under this framework, under this system. So it doesn't mean to say that the Chinese leaders would feel that a partnership with America means that they follow the sort of American interests and rules that the Americans favor. But it does mean that if the United States is prepared to treat China as an equal, if the United States is looking upon the growth of China and of China itself as a major power, or indeed the major power within which the United States seeks to cooperate. This is seen as beneficial from a Chinese point of view. There are different voices in China. There are some who identify themselves as the new left and who regard all this relationship as something unhealthy for China. They see it as westernizing China, and they see it as the source of all the troubles in terms of the inequalities within the country and inequalities between regions and so on. And some of them say they would like to have a new kind of triangular relationship, that is to say, relying on Moscow with China as a way of limiting American power and perhaps even seeking to change the system. But this view, although it does have some support within the leadership, nevertheless is still not the mainstream of Chinese policy. But as far as the relationship with Japan, therefore, is concerned, there's a sense in which China and Japan do share certain interests. They share an interest in helping to maintain the current order, that even though it is on the whole an American one. The Chinese are very receptive to those in Tokyo who want to put an emphasis on Japan's Asian identity and therefore want to have better relations with East Asians and not rely as much on the United States as they have done before. So for them it's kind of a balance, a rebalancing they want to do. But as far as the rest of the East Asia, and in the particular issues in East Asia, the two may be seen in many respects as rivals, in the sense that if you lift your eyes beyond the immediate issue of North Korea and proliferation and look as to what kinds of alternatives are available, you will see that Chinese and Japanese interests do not coincide. Because if North Korea were to be accepted as some kind of nuclear power, that would be seen as threatening to the Japanese side. Likewise, if there were to be some kind of reunification in Korea, it's likely to be one in which Chinese influence would be much greater than that of Japan. Meanwhile, the Japanese are partners with the United States in developing ballistic missile defense systems, notionally against North Korea. But the better these defense systems become, the more they are also likely to affect China's missile capabilities. So this is another kind of source of tension. With regard to Taiwan, although the Japanese say that they favor peaceful as opposed to any other kind of unification, there are many within Japan who would see a reunification of Taiwan with China as something that would be inimical to their interests. They would feel that Japan would be, in many respects, surrounded, that its sea lanes would be more vulnerable, and if one looks at Southeast Asia, this has been a place where traditionally the Japanese have had a stronger economic influence, and now they see that being overtaken by Chinese, and so you find that the Japanese, for the last few years, have been in a sense playing catch-up with China. That when the Chinese announced they were going to have a free trade association or free trade agreement with ASEAN. The Japanese followed up not too long later. The Japanese have been attempting to have various forms of cooperative agreements, economic agreements with Asian or Southeast Asian countries separate from China. That when the idea came up of a East Asian community or East Asian summit, the Chinese favored a much closer East Asian grouping of the ASEAN, the 10 ASEAN countries plus the 3 of South Korea, China and Japan. The Japanese, together with the Singaporeans, were influential in having the summit include also India, Australia and New Zealand. So now you have a Japanese new Prime Minister saying he wants to have a new kind of East Asian community. And when he met Hu Jintao and the group of 20, he raised this, and he also talked about possibly having a common Asian currency. And you could see Hu Jintao's response was very guarded. I think within Japan, there are a whole number of different views about how this kind of community issue should be developed. Two previous prime ministers had, before becoming prime ministers, talked about having some kind of League of Democracies in Asia. And this would introduce an element of ideology and perhaps even political pressure upon China that would have been unwelcome. So it's a very difficult kind of relationship. It requires careful management by both sides. Within China, the efforts to improve the image of Japan since 2006 has been relatively successful. A big fuss was made of a Japanese rescue team when there was the earthquake in Sichuan. The reporting on Japan in Chinese press has been much more positive. And in fact, opinion polls show that although there's still a majority of Chinese who feel very distrustful of Japan, the gap between them and those who feel better about Japan has narrowed considerably. In Japan, on the other hand, there's still something like 65 to 70% of the people polled who have a very distrustful attitude towards China. So there's still a very uneasy relationship, and one that requires, I think, continual attention and management by the two sets of leaders. As far as the Southeast Asia is concerned, I think one could argue that a degree of competition, if not rivalry, between China and Japan is probably beneficial. But if it were to revert to outright hostility again, I think that would have negative implications. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Yahuda.
My name is Moller, and I work at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies. First of all, thank you very much for a very comprehensive and elucidating presentation. I wonder whether you could say a little bit about what I call the generational shift in the two countries. You talked a little bit about it, what that was among the political leaders. But if you look at the population, those below, let's say, 25 or 30 years in those countries, they haven't known the Cold War. And they may know about from history books the period where Japan was a rising power. But now they only know about Japan as a declining power and China as a rising power. So their outlook of Asia, as I see it, is one of Japan in decline, uncertainty about the US, and a rise of China. And especially I detect among the young Japanese a wish to liberate themselves of the link to the US and become a much more Asian power, which may open up for some opportunities for cooperation among China and Japan. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And the generational issue is, in many respects, one of the most important ones in this part of the world, in Asia. It's, in a sense, it's formally recognized within China by the leadership in terms of seeing succession between one generation and another. And I think that as far as the younger generation in China is concerned, there is a problem in really coming to terms with what are the full range of views held there. The thing we know most about are about the people who write nasty things on the internet, the so-called angry youth, the fun chink. And they bother the leadership a lot because the leadership is afraid to make compromises in foreign affairs because they will be accused of selling out China's interests. So even though they may not necessarily have experience of the Cold War, they won't have experience of the Cultural Revolution, they won't have experience of many things, and nevertheless they seem to be imbued with a very sort of emotional kind of patriotism, and it came out in the Olympic Games, and it comes out in all sorts of different ways. Now, the difficulty is in assessing how representative such of these views are. I think part of the difficulty is that Chinese have been brought up to think of their country as a victim, and at issue will be how many of them can have really changed into thinking of their country as having achieved great things, and that they should now speak with confidence and therefore perhaps get on better with others, with their neighbors, not only Japan but others too. And so far I think the evidence is mixed. But as I say, the greatest noise is made by these angry youth, and on the Japanese side, it's even more difficult to judge. The collapse of the Japanese model has hit young people especially hard. There's still a proportion of them who can get good jobs and in the government and in some of the major firms, and they still embody, if you like, the whole idea of the so-called salaryman. But there's also a very large number, especially of younger people, who can only get temporary jobs and don't therefore fit in with that ideal. And some of them have become very despondent. Others have become sort of stay-at-home people. There is much concern in Japan about not so much relative decline vis-à-vis China, but about the actual decline of the population, and of the fact that younger people are not marrying and not having, not producing enough children. In fact, the new government that comes in has wants to introduce a special measure to encourage people to have more children and so on. So as far as sort of international affairs are concerned, there seems to be public opinion polls showing that younger people want Japan to play a more active role in international affairs. And as far as it can be ascertained, the majority of them seem to want Japan to do so in a kind of a peaceful way. That is to say, work very much with the United Nations, contribute more to United Nations peacekeeping operations, contribute to the new international agenda of climate change and things of this sort. Alongside that, there are also those who feel that that Japan should be Japan, and Japan should be some kind of normal country, and so that there are mixed views, and it's very difficult to determine how things will work out. Some observers who know Japan very well, better than I, feel that there's a real danger that this new government that has come in will not be able to deliver on the program that it has, and therefore it may create a certain disillusionment with normal politics. And they point out to the fact that here under Koizumi, the Liberal Democrats enjoyed something more than 300 seats in the Diet and had a 2/3 majority. Now we find that the pendulum has swung exactly the other way, and the DPG has more than 300 seats, and yet there doesn't seem to have been sort of any noticeable movements in Japanese political opinion. So the danger is, if this new government will also fail to deliver the change and the reforms that people think are necessary, then what would be the alternative? The Japanese history from the 1920s and 1930s does not suggest a very happy alternative. It is one where the two extremes prospered, and it led to the sort of violent politics of the right. So there is a sense of uncertainty about Japan, and I think that is still in the minds especially of the Chinese and the Koreans, who suffered particularly from the Japanese.
I make a complimentary comment on this. When I go to Japan and China, talk to the younger people, I mean those in 20-something, 30-something, I found a tremendous fundamental difference. You talk to the Chinese youth, they are very confident in the future. They believe through their hard working, they can do better than the father generation. This kind of confidence in the future gives a kind of mentality and a kind of psychology which is, in my view, is quite upward. But you go to Japan, this is the first generation. You talk to the Japanese, like you said, stay-at-home people who cannot get a good job. The Japanese youth have this kind of worry. They lost their confidence in the future. They know no matter how hard they try, no matter how hard they work, they may not be able to do better than their father's generation or even do worse. This kind of lost confidence in the future also has a huge negative mentality on the Japanese youth. I believe that this might have some impact on the future Sino-Japan relationship. That's just a
comment. I want to make some comment on the relationships. My name is Henry. I'm teaching in Xi'an Jiao Tong University. I've been in China for 6 years, so I'm as observers. I want to make some comment on the relationships between China and Japan, and also China and America. As you say that there are angry youth in China protesting the relationships about against the numbers of areas. For example, the Japanese financial and also the military expansions in Asia. But at official level, actually, the Chinese governments and Japanese governments are in good terms. Contrast to the relationship between the Chinese and Americans. Officially, the American and the Chinese governments are a loggerhead on some of the issues, especially talking about the currency issues. But in general, the Chinese populations are favorable to the American, say, products or the American educations, and have a good feelings towards the Americans. So this is quite a difference between the relationship between the Japan and China. So one is the official and the other is not the officials, just the we call it different relationships.
Well, it's possible to argue these things in various ways. America looms enormously large in China's foreign relations. America is really the only country that I think Chinese leaders feel could set back the Chinese economy, set back the program, if you like, that has been developed in China. And it's a very difficult relationship. Firstly, every American president and his team who come into office feel that they've got to somehow or other reinvent the wheel. And this is the coming of the Obama administration is the first time when there's been a fairly smooth transfer as far as China policy is concerned. Every president before then took a very critical view of the predecessor's policy towards China. So from a Chinese perspective, the American policies have been unpredictable. Although, as I said before, the Chinese actually say that they have prospered under this system that has been set up by the Americans. And in that sense, they don't want confrontations with America. But America is still a place where senior leaders want their children to go for higher education. America is still admired in all sorts of different ways. But in many respects, so is Japan. Japan has enormous investments in China. Japanese pop culture is quite popular in China. As far as younger people are concerned, there is a sort of, I think, a degree of instability in the way they look at the outside world, including Japan and the United States. If there were to be another big incident involving the United States, I'm sure you could see the young Chinese being quite happy to go out in the streets and protest and so on if they're allowed to do so. Similarly with regard to Japan. So I'm not so sure that the contrast is as sharp as you suggested.
Thank you. My name is Kyoko Kuwajima, a fellow to this school from Japan. And thank you very much for your presentation. That is very comprehensive. And your presentation mostly touched upon the political relations between China and Japan. But we often see that the relation in politics is very cold. But economic relations is still robust. And actually, the economic relations, the interdependence has been increased. And I see the difference between the economic relations and political relations create some sort of imbalances. So how could you view between the relations, and how could you suggest to improve the temperature difference between the political and economic relations? Thank you.
Well, the economic relationship is very important, especially given the size of the economic relations between China and Japan. I know there are millions of jobs in China that Japanese companies have created. Japan's relative economic growth that took place until the recent financial downturn owed a lot to the growth of their exports to China. And you could also argue that there are economic interests in each country which have political implications in terms of relations. But nevertheless, it seems that one can't rely on economic interdependence alone. And political scientists always make reference to the First World War, where Germany and Britain, for example, were very, very close economically, very interdependent and so on. And yet the war broke out. In fact, there's a very famous author who wrote a book in 1909 saying that a war was inconceivable because the economies of Europe were so interdependent, and that it would be so destructive and so on. Well, it did happen, and he was right. It did turn out to be terribly destructive. And I think that this is one aspect where both the Chinese and the Japanese leaders are conscious of. They're conscious of the need to avoid armed conflict. They're also trying to build on social relations. The number of Chinese students in Japan, in universities, far exceeds that of the rest of the world put together in Japan. I think the number is something like 80,000 out of a university, foreign students of about 110,000. There are a large number of Japanese students in China as well. I think they're just less than the Koreans, but nevertheless, I think it's around 30,000 or something of that sort. The tourism has grown enormously, not only from Japan to China, but also from China to Japan. So one can point to these things and hope for improvements. But I think what would be important is the sort of the political sentiments that are cultivated there. That is to say, in China, if the nationalism can move away from the sense of victimhood to the sense of saying, you know, we have achieved a lot, we are respected now in the world, and in that sense, be, if you like, a nationalism or patriotism based on pride rather than on resentment, that would make a big difference. As far as Japan is concerned, if the economy can be turned around so that people or younger people would feel more confident, that too would make a difference. So I think we have to look at the multiplicity of things, and not just the economic.
I have one more question. Yes.
Good evening, sir. I'm Saran. I'm a student from a local junior college. Okay, I have studied your essay in school, and I like it a lot. It's on Sino-Japanese ties. Okay, is it possible I fill two questions? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, my first question is, right, Mr. Hatoyama has recently charted pretty clear foreign policy towards the US as well as China. On one hand, to the US, he said that the US still remains the cornerstone of Japanese foreign policy, but on the other hand, he said that China is still very important to Japan because Asia to Japan is basic sphere of well-being. So these two rhetorics are quite clear, but when they are put together, I feel it's rather ambivalent. So in a short to medium term, what do you think will be more important to Mr. Hatoyama? And for my second question will be, recently also Mr. Hatoyama said that, he proposed that there should be a East Asia Union, right? Yeah, East Asia community. So how far do you think that he's serious about this? Because, or do you think that he's reasserting Japanese influence in East Asia after he has taken up the premiership? Thank you very much.
Well, Hatoyama hasn't been in government, I think, for even a week. And he has an inexperienced team. He has set himself an agenda which is going to be very difficult to carry out. And I think it's too early to make a judgment about his performance. And as to how he might, as you put it, balance China and the United States. And with the United States, for example, he says he wants a more equal relationship. He wants to renegotiate the agreements regarding American bases in Okinawa. And he's also argued that he doesn't like American-style capitalism. Now, at the same time, if he wants the United States to be a cornerstone, then he's going to have to finesse these positions, and I'm not sure whether he can do that. I think the Americans recognize that they can't just simply impose their views on the new Japanese government. And then I think the Chinese side, although they have welcomed his coming into power, they clearly prefer him to the alternative, that is to say the former Prime Minister Aso. But I think they too will be waiting to see how the new government establishes itself and how it will deal with the major problems within Japan itself, because that's where he's going to be tried and tested. He's got elections coming up to the upper house in a year's time. And so that sets a kind of deadline for him, so he's got to do quite a lot fairly quickly. Now, he won't be able to establish the community in that time. And I think most people think that what he has said so far about the community is quite impracticable, because he says he wants to have something like the European Union. Now, the European Union involves a pooling of sovereignty. I'm not sure, I mean, even if Japan might be willing to pool its sovereignty, I'm not sure that the Chinese will be willing to do that. And there may be many other countries in the region who don't want to do that. So I think that, and also he's talked about having a common currency. Well, it's one thing having currency swap arrangements, which they have done, and the Japanese and Chinese did it very carefully so that they put in to the pot exactly the same amount each one, so that suggests that they're conscious of the fact that there is a degree of rivalry and they want to overcome it. So I think that if you give Hatsuyama a little longer, we'll find that some of these ideas will be forgotten about as he tries to do other things. But I'm sure he's very serious in wanting to, if I give a greater emphasis to relations with China and with Korea, South Korea. And I'm sure he also wants to see if Japan can perhaps play a more constructive role in the six-party talks with North Korea too. The Russians as well have expectations of him. So there are many countries who are looking at him with some expectations. And, but I think his real task will be at home. If he can't do something about the situation within Japan, then all the rest won't count for anything.